London is a city of ghosts. If you walk through the financial district today, you are surrounded by the gleam of glass and the hum of the modern world. But beneath the asphalt, a different city lies buried, a city of timber, bone and stone that vanished nearly 4 centuries ago. For hundreds of years, the true face of medieval London has been lost to us. We have relied on faded sketches and the dry ink of old chronicles to imagine the narrow alleys, the towering spires, and the filth of the streets. Until now, by fusing historical records with the power of modern artificial intelligence, we have peeled back the layers of time. We are not just telling you the story of the past, we are rebuilding it. From the shadow of the tower to the noise of the market, we have used technology to resurrect the lost city, stone by virtual stone. London was not always a sprawling metropolis. It was a cage. In the medieval era, the boundary of the world was defined by the ancient Roman wall, a 2-mile circuit of stone standing 20 feet high. Inside this barrier, the city was a pressure cooker of humanity, tightly packed into a single square mile. By the 14th century, nearly 40,000 souls were crammed into this space, living on top of one another in a dense tangle of timber and clay. To enter the city, you had to pass through one of the 7 great gates: Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Moorgate, Bishopsgate, or Aldgate. These were not just open arches. They were fortified checkpoints, toll booths, and prisons all in one. As you passed beneath the stone archway, you would leave the fresh air of the countryside and be hit by a wall of noise and stench. This was a pedestrian city, a maze of winding lanes, so narrow that carts often scraped the walls of the houses on either side. There was no urban planning here, only organic, chaotic growth. Space was the ultimate currency, leading citizens to build upwards, their houses jettying out over the street floor by floor, turning the alleyways below into perpetual twilight tunnels, where the sun rarely touched the ground. To the east, standing guard over the river approach, and looming over the wooden city, lies the ultimate symbol of oppression, the Tower of London. At its heart stands the White Tower, a structure that would have terrified the medieval population. Built by William the Conqueror shortly after 1066, this was never intended to be a palace for the people's enjoyment. It was a calculated weapon of psychological warfare, constructed of white cane stone imported all the way from France to gleam blindingly on the skyline, a foreign rock for a foreign king. For the native Anglo-Saxon population, the tower was a constant reminder that they were a conquered people. Throughout the medieval era, the fortress evolved into a self-contained city of war. Kings added concentric curtain walls and a massive water-filled moat fed by the Thames, turning it into the most secure fortress in Europe. While it served as a royal residence and a mint for the kingdom's coinage, its reputation was darker. It housed the royal menagerie, where lions, leopards, and polar bears, gifts from European monarchs, roared in the darkness, their alien sounds echoing over the city walls. But mostly it was a place of silence and state secrets. To be sent to the tower via the Traitor's Gate, passing beneath the damp stone arch from the river, was often to disappear from the world of the living forever. If the tower is the city's fist, the bridge is its lifeline. For centuries, this was the only way to cross the Thames on foot, funneling all traffic from the south into the city. It was not merely a bridge, it was a miracle of medieval engineering and a bustling town in its own right. Finished in 1209, the bridge rested on 19 irregular stone arches, guarded by a drawbridge and fortified gatehouses. But looking at it, you would hardly know it was a bridge at all. It was a floating street, lined with shops, haberdasheries, and houses that towered up to 7 stories high, leaning perilously over the rushing water. Crossing the bridge was a sensory gauntlet. The street was narrow, perpetually choked with carts, livestock, and travelers. The noise was deafening, dominated by the roar of the water below. The heavy stone arches acted as a dam, restricting the flow of the Thames and forcing the tide through narrow gaps. This created raging rapids with a drop of several feet, a phenomenon known as shooting the bridge. Many foolhardy boatmen drowned trying to navigate these violent currents. And at the southern gatehouse, the stone giants showed their teeth, a forest of iron spikes displaying the severed heads of traitors. Dipped in tar to preserve them and picked at by seabirds, these heads stared blankly southwards, a brutal welcome greeting visitors to the uncompromising reality of London law. Rising from the highest hill in the city is the spiritual heart of the nation. Old St. Paul's Cathedral. We know the domed masterpiece of Christopher Wren today, but the medieval cathedral was a different beast entirely. A Gothic leviathan that dwarfed everything around it. By the 14th century, it was one of the longest churches in the world, a sprawling complex of stone and stained glass, but its most striking feature was the spire. Soaring nearly 500 feet into the air, it was one of the tallest structures in all of Christendom, a needle piercing the clouds that was visible from miles away in the countryside, acting as a compass for every traveler. Yet, the interior of this holy place was not always a sanctuary of quiet reflection. The massive central nave, known as Paul's Walk, functioned less like a church and more like the city's marketplace and news hub. Here the sacred and the profane collided. Lawyers met their clients by the pillars, prostitutes sought customers in the shadows, and merchants struck deals for wool and wine, their haggling drowning out the prayers of the choir in the chancel. Outside at Paul's Cross, radical preachers would address crowds of thousands, sparking riots and political movements. It was the perfect microcosm of medieval London, a place where God and mammon, holiness and hustle existed under one massive leaking roof. Back inside the city walls, there is a rival to the cathedral's power, the Guildhall. While the king ruled from Westminster and the bishop from St. Paul's, the true engine of the city was trade. The Guildhall, rebuilt in the early 15th century, served as the cathedral of commerce. It represented the immense power of the Lord Mayor and the mighty livery companies, the fishmongers, the goldsmiths, the mercers, and the drapers. These guilds were not just trade unions. They were the mafia, the police, and the government of the city rolled into one. In the medieval world, money could rival bloodlines. The Guildhall was the fortress where these merchant princes governed themselves. They set the prices of goods, strictly controlled who was allowed to work, and maintained a monopoly on quality. Inside the Great Hall, under the gaze of the legendary giants Gog and Magog, lavish feasts were held that rivaled royal banquets. It was a fortress of bureaucracy that even pickets were hesitant to cross. Monarchs like Edward III and Henry V knew that while they held the crown, the merchants of London held the purse strings. Without the gold flowing through this hall, the king's armies could not be paid, and his wars could not be fought. If the Guildhall is the brain of the economy, Cheapside is its stomach. Cheap is the Old English word for market, and here in the shadow of the church of St. Mary le Bow lay the widest and most famous street in the city. It was a riot of colour, noise, and aggressive capitalism. The city was strictly zoned by trade, creating a map drawn by smell and sound. You bought your bread on Bread Street, your milk on Milk Street, and your poultry in the Poultry. You navigated the chaos by dodging the iron-shod wheels of carts and the shouting of hawkers, hot peas cods, sheep's feet mackerel. The noise was so intense it was said you could barely hear the church bells ring. In the center of the market stood the great conduit, where free water flowed, and the Standard, a place of execution and punishment. Justice here was commercial and immediate. A baker caught selling a loaf that was too light was not merely fined. He was strapped to a hurdle and dragged through the mud of the streets with the offending loaf tied around his neck. A fishmonger selling rotting wares might have his stock burned under his nose while he stood in the pillory. In a world without digital regulation, public humiliation was the only way to keep the market honest. 2 miles upstream, distinct and separate from the City of London, lies the seat of royal power, Westminster. To get there, most Londoners would take a boat, using the Thames as a highway to escape the crowded streets. The crown jewel of this royal complex is Westminster Hall, with walls dating back to the 11th century and a magnificent hammer beam roof added by Richard II in the 1390s. This was the largest hall in Europe. It remains an architectural marvel today, a massive oak roof spanning nearly 70 feet without a single central pillar to support it, adorned with flying angels carved from wood. This was the grand stage for the theatre of monarchy. It was here that coronation banquets were held, where wine flowed from fountains and the king's champion would ride a horse into the hall to challenge anyone who disputed the monarch's right to rule. But it was also the engine of the king's justice. The high courts of England, the King's Bench, the Court of Common Pleas, and the Court of Chancery sat in different corners of this vast open space. It was within these cold stone walls that William Wallace was condemned to death, and where the course of history was decided by the bang of a gavel. For a medieval citizen, entering this hall was designed to make them feel small, shrinking beneath the weight of royal authority. Step off the roaring thoroughfare, duck your head into a side alley, and you enter a different world. The domestic life of the medieval Londoner. For the average citizen, the carpenter, the weaver, the labourer, home was a narrow vertical slice of timber frame. The ground floor was rarely for living, it was for working. It was the shop front, the workshop, open to the street and the elements. To find the family, you had to climb the steep ladder to the solar, the upper room where life actually happened. Inside, the world was dim and smoky. Glass was a luxury for the rich. The poor made do with lattice windows covered in oil-soaked cloth or thin translucent horn, letting in a milky yellow light. The air was thick and greasy, smelling of wood smoke from the central hearth and the acrid stench of tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist. A family of 6 might eat, sleep, and pray in a single room. They slept on straw pallets, often sitting up to prevent fluid buildup in the lungs, huddled together for warmth against the damp English chill. The floor was covered in rushes, dried reeds and herbs meant to sweeten the air, but beneath the fresh layer often lay a compost of old food scraps, ale spillages and mud tracked in from the street. It was a hard, dark existence, lived almost entirely in the shadow of the great stone giants outside. For centuries, this medieval skyline stood firm. The stone giants watched over a city of wood, pitch, and straw. But the city's architecture carried the seeds of its own destruction. Though this date falls after the medieval period has officially ended, it is the moment the medieval city physically dies. A spark in a bakery on Pudding Lane ignites the dry timber of the ancient streets. A strong east wind turns the fire into a firestorm. The fire does not respect history. It consumes the wooden houses on London Bridge. It melts the lead roof of Old St. Paul's, sending a river of molten metal flowing down the streets. The great Gothic stones explode in the heat. In 4 days, the medieval city is erased. The narrow alleys, the jettying timber houses, the towering Gothic spire, all reduced to ash. From the ruins, a new modern city of brick and wide avenues would rise. But deep beneath the surface, in the foundations of the modern capital, the ghosts of the medieval giants still remain.